G'day everyone, welcome back to another episode of Spark Your Fire. Gosh, it's Friday again and it's cold. Seriously, like you can see for those people who's on the video, you can see I'm fully rugged up. John's still looking very cozy in his new home. Obviously got fantastic lighting, heating's all done. On the
Yeah.
other side, I'm not doing as well, unfortunately. So I had to
No,
rub
you're
myself
definitely
up,
rugged
mate.
up. Rugged up. Yeah, very nice. No, nice to see you and happy Friday. God, I love Friday.
Exactly, John. It's yeah, time just flies basically. So,
Mm.
pretty much in mid-June already. Getting ready for the new
Yeah.
financial year, John. I reckon
Yeah.
it'll be a strong new financial year with more expectations on interest rate cuts.
Yep.
I think yeah, more people looking at properties and a lot more demand.
Yeah.
Actually, anecdotally, are you finding that people are more aggressive in terms of their offers? Are you seeing the kind of the turnaround time or the days on market started to trending down? Just hypothetically.
Yeah, I'm seeing. So I'm definitely seeing that. What I'm seeing is agents don't run 4 week campaigns anymore. They run 2 to 3 week campaigns,
Shorter campaign.
and they also all they want is 2 Saturdays. Like I still think most things aren't going to auction. They're selling prior, but the average agent I think is running a 10 day campaign. They're
Mm.
running. They just want 2 Saturdays and then they sell it. Um, so things are going quickly, but I also think that they like short, sharp campaigns anyway. I think that's been the trend over the last couple of years.
Yeah, I did notice that. I think a lot of the agents are pushing for properties to be sold before the auction. So
Yeah,
there's a lot of sold prior to auction type of scenario
correct.
that's been happening, right? So yeah, interesting.
Especially for units. Units, I think, sell prior. I think that the demand is just lighter for units in general, and I think that when they get a bird in the hand, they put the deal together. But every area is different. Every market's different. And the average time on the market is still like 25 days, but
That's not
pretty
bad. That's solid.
yeah,
That is solid.
yeah,
That's about three
excellent.
weeks and a little bit, right? So
Yeah, yeah, that's right. That's right.
and
Yeah.
I think I don't have the numbers in front of me, but from memory, the core logic numbers for last month, actually, I think it's the first time that Sydney's units growth has now exceeded
Yes.
the houses, isn't it? I mean,
Yes.
although I can't remember how much, but I think that was one of the key notings that was on the core logic report. So
Yeah.
units, I think, are on the rise at the moment.
Definitely. I mean, some things can't get any cheaper, relatively speaking. Units are quite inexpensive from that perspective.
Mm.
But yeah, last weekend the clearance rate was higher for units, and I know that there have been some dear friends that people we both know who are sort of scavengers, and they've been going into the old kind of red brick, blonde
Oh
brick
yeah,
apartments
yeah,
because they're selling it replacement value. We've been saying this for a little while on this podcast,
that's
but
true.
that's very good buying at the moment. And I know some people sort of shy away from buying apartments, but I think in Sydney, for example, an old red or blonde brick walk up is a timeless classic when it comes to investing. And right now they're quite inexpensive. But land is always king, of course.
They are pushing up, slowly edging up in prices, although, without people noticing. I think that's what they
Yeah,
do. The quiet and steady performers, as we normally call them.
yeah,
Like the
yeah,
houses are the ones that take all the spotlights, but not the units. But yeah, they are creeping up now. So.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Anyway, so I think, with the changing sentiment, I reckon, for what we can do today is to help our listeners is to actually help demonstrate how John, obviously as a buyer's agent himself, how he actually derives the true value of the property. So, we're going to use an example to demonstrate that. Obviously, for privacy purposes, we're not going to reveal the street and the suburb, so we're just going to use a fictitious suburb there. But at least the underlying workings and the logic there is very much worth sharing with our audiences. So that way, if you got properties that you like and you want like to know how much the true value is in that instance, this is something that you definitely don't want to miss.
Yeah, yeah. No, well, let's. So, I mean, I should do the caveat up front. I'm not a valuer, but I'm an accountant and I'm a licensed real estate agent that does buying. So, but I do want to say that this is not, this is going to be part technical, part intuition
Yep.
when it comes to sort of putting a deal together.
Yes.
The first thing you've got to do is figure out what it's really worth.
That's right.
Um,
Yeah. And look, and if I'm just acting, if I'm just standing from a buyer's perspective, right? Like I saw a property, I really like it. The sales agents give me a price guide. How do I go about finding out what it's really worth? And
yeah,
and that's the underlying rationale in terms of how we can do this and looking at it from your professional buyer's agent perspective to say, if I'm basically buying this property for my client, these are the things that I would do. So I thought, that's definitely worth sharing. So this is going to be part one, and then I think afterwards, let's say for example, you worked out the true value of the property or at least a range. Then in our next section, we will then talk about how John would approach negotiating this with the sales agent in order to try to maximize your opportunity to be able to secure that property. Because we
yeah,
know that we are going into a market that is quite competitive at the moment. So you definitely want to have some tips and tricks about how you can actually increase that success rate of your offers. And there's a few
yeah.
tips that I think John can share with us. Probably not in today's episode, but we'll leave that for the next time.
Yeah, yeah. We'll do valuations first and negotiations second. But I mean, as we said, like understand doing the most I think important part of the negotiation is having a very solid view of who's right when it comes to like, is the asking price fair? Is the asking price cheap? If the
Mhm.
asking price is cheap, it's very easy to put a deal together. Then, if the asking price is ambitious, then you can uh, act accordingly. But let me, I'll go through I won't give you the address, but I'll go through an apartment that's currently for sale in Randwick, and we can have a discussion about how I would go about valuing it.
Sounds good, John. Let's get in.
Yeah. So two-bedroom unit, one bathroom, and a parking spot in Randwick, and it's the agent is guiding 1.2 million. Sounds reasonable. It's an old, I think it's a red brick walk up on the subject. It's reasonably good location for Randwick, and so took my client to see it. They liked it, and so we're the first thing I do before I start talking to the agent is having a chat about uh, what I think it's worth, right? So that's kind of the context and the process so far. And by the time this airs, it may have sold, by the way. So this is don't look it up. Um, So there are four ways I value a property, right? And I'll go through each of them a little bit more specifically. But the four ways are: firstly, I had to write this down. So firstly, it's the guide, like what's the agent guiding? So that's the first way to craft an expectation. The
Mhm.
second thing is what we call comparables. Comparables are the most important way to value a property for residential. That's number two. Number three is rent capitalization.
Mhm.
So this is what you find commercial property valuers use, but I apply it to my resi deals as well, and it's quite informative. So that's rent capitalization. I'll explain what that is later. And the fourth and final thing is like momentum. We talk a lot about momentum on this podcast because any analysis you do of the price, it's always rear vision mirror. So you have to kind of adjust your expectations sometimes for where's the puck going, where's the market right now? Is it hot? Is it slow? And then you can dial it up or down. So they're the four things: the guide from the agent, comparables, rent capitalization, and intuition slash momentum. So should we do
Yep,
a
let's go
deal?
for an actual
All right.
example. Let's do a deal. Let's pull it apart, see what the underlying thinking is.
I'm going to share my screen. Remember, this property in Randwick. Okay. So the and this is a snippet of the workings of like a discussion paper that I put together for any property that we make an offer on. So we won't make an offer without me going back to my corner and running some numbers. In this case, in this for this agent, the agent is guiding $1.2 million. Something like that
Mhm.
sounds reasonable. That sounds fair. So what's the first thing I do? The first thing I'll do is run a price finder report to generate comparables.
Okay.
Price finder report is I subscribe to CoreLogic and Price Finder. I find Price Finder is a bit better on coming up with valuations, partly because you can sort of adjust for them. So I tweak for superiority versus inferiority of the comparable.
Mm.
But Price Finder will generate a blended estimate. based on recent sales. In this case, it's 1.350. So that's interesting, right? So all of a sudden we're miles away from the guide,
True.
and
Yep.
so that's a good start. So now I double check that the comparables are relevant, but nonetheless, 1.350 is where that lands.
So just so I guess just to elaborate on that, what you're saying is that that comparables that you do is not the straight shot value that's showing on domain for this property, but instead you've gone through let's say, because on the domain price finder, if I'm not mistaken, when you pull it up, it basically gives you a list of all the comparable properties. You can get to choose to say, okay, well, it's got the attributes on there too. Let's say you're looking for the two-bedroom unit. It'll give you two-bedroom
Yep.
unit, let's say one bathroom, one garage, big land, internal size. You then determine, okay, is this one superior or inferior?
Mm.
Is this comparable superior, inferior? You get to choose one of those. And then, once you make that decision, it will then automatically adjust that valuation slightly based on your decision. And then you do
Yep.
the same for, let's say, 3 to 5 similar comparables in order to try to get to that final 1.35 figure. Is that correct?
Correct. So it'll let's say this is a two-bedroom unit. It'll throw up comparables. One of the comparables might be a two-bedroom unit without a parking spot. So
Mm,
what I'll do is I'll tell Pricefinder that that comparable is inferior to the subject property.
yep. Hmm.
And so what it'll do is it'll moderately bump up the
Pump it
estimate.
up. Yep.
When you look at houses, there might be some comparables that don't have the same land size, or they might be a different zone. So for the housing, like clicking in and figuring out what zone the comparables are is really important. R2, R3, R4.
Mm, mm,
But then you adjust the comparables, and so that's what
yep.
what I've done here to get to the 1.35. You don't want to tinker too much with it because you want it to be as organic and unmanipulated as possible. But by the same token, I don't want it to just be a desktop valuation. I want it to be an adjusted valuation based on having viewed the property. So
Yeah, basically you've tweaked it or you've updated it based on your own
correct,
own
correct,
eyes. There's many human interventions in there.
yeah.
Now, how many comparables do you go through?
So there are about seven.
7? Okay.
But there's one interesting thing that wasn't in my little intro. I will always look at the last two sales in that block.
The
Now,
last.
they might be a couple of years old and they might not have appeared in the price finder report, but I'll always say the last property that sold in this block sold for this amount and it was the same or different because quite often you're going to have identical floor plans.
Mm,
Um, so always, yeah, so there's always the general area that's generated from Price Finder, which is domain. And then there's always what was the last thing to sell on the block.
mm,
And in this case, it was back in 2022. There
interesting.
was a previous sale. And
Okay.
now the previous sale had an extra parking spot, but it sold for over 1.5 million. So now I'm starting to think, well, this $1.2 million guide is very inaccurate, but I haven't done all my diligence yet. So we've got the comparables as generated by Price Finder tweaked for relevance, and then I've got the latest sale or two in the block.
Yep.
So and that will always go in my commentary. Then the next one we're up to methodology number three is the rent or yield capitalization method. So what that is, and I mentioned that's more of a commercial property valuation method, but it's quite valuable, particularly for investors. So what that says is if you can estimate a rent, and sometimes it's easier to estimate rent than it is to estimate a sale price,
Mm,
right? Because
mm.
it might have just come, been a rental prior to it going on the market. But generally speaking, rental estimates are a little bit easier to come up with than price estimates. So I do a rental estimate. Maybe that's from Price Finder, maybe it's just from the agent. And then I say, what's the gross yield for a two-bedroom unit in Randwick in this case? Well, 3.6%. Okay. So then what I do is I take my estimated rent and then I gross it up by the rental yield,
Mm.
3.6%,
Yep.
and times it by 52 weeks.
Yeah, correct.
And then I get a rental yield. Now the yield capitalization method in this instance was 1.4 million or 1.399. So it's either correct or my rent estimate's too high. But at least now I'm kind of trying to balance up all these different estimates. I actually think that the rent is right, and I think the 1.4 million is right.
Mm,
Uh,
okay.
so it is unrenovated property, by the way. But the good thing about the yield capitalization method is that if it's an unrenovated property, that price will be baked into the rent, right? So if it's a bit tired and a bit old, um, the rent will reflect that. So that's why it's really good to get to a rental number and then gross it up. And
Yeah.
that's what the yield capitalization method does. So really valuable. Now, the reason this is quite interesting is like we've got a bit of a spread here. We've got like vendors' expectations if they're real of 1.2, maybe a bit more. Yield capitalization 1.4. Now, if we went to an auction and this sold for 1.4, people would gasp in horror. They would say the agent said it was 1.2,
Mm,
but it sold for 1.4. The market's crazy. You hear that all the time. The market's crazy. Well, the odds are that the property was never worth 1.2. The property was probably always worth 1.4.
mm,
And uh, and so and so yield capitalization is really good at giving you like another way of looking at the valuation. So
mm.
right now we're kind of at about 1.4 million, give or take,
Yep.
compared to a guide of 1.2. So rent capitalization is the third method, and then finally, which is not on the screen. Actually, do you want to talk about rent capitalization before we move on, or
Go for it.
questions or comments?
Yeah, look, John, I think this is no, this is definitely helpful. So basically, you've got three numbers here at the moment, right? So you've got the
Yep.
original 1.2 as a price guide. You've got the comparables that you've gone through, tweaked, updated from Price Finder. You then work it backwards using the yield capitalization
Yep.
method to be able to come to around the 1.4. So you can see it's like a step process. Basically, each step kind of gives you another figure to be able to validate and verify to say, are we getting closer to the
Yep.
actual figures and the actual true magical value that we're
Yep.
here? But I guess my question is, you got three figures here. How do
Yep.
you then, what's the next step and how do you derive, like how do you actually work out from here to say, what is my true value?
Yeah, right. Well, then that's the fourth. The fourth method is like drawing a conclusion,
Hmm.
making an estimate based on the momentum, the sentiment in the market, and saying, is this a $1.2 million property? Let's say it's
Yep.
2008, 2009, maybe 1.2 million is going to do it. Or was there just an interest rate cut? And are there expected to be more interest? Well, that's probably more like 1.4 or
Yeah.
maybe closer to the 1.5 that the previous property in the building sold for, even though it had that other parking spot it was a couple of years ago. So then you apply your own judgment. So my advice in this instance was that it was worth 1.4 million plus or minus 50,000.
Okay.
So if it got to 1.45 million, that's not an outrageous valuation based on all we know about this property. It's at the upper end and it's expensive, but it's not, that would actually, 1.45 wouldn't be crazy for this property. So that would be the range. I'd say it's between 1.35 and 1.45 for this property. Um,
But how do you derive at that 50K plus minus? Like why was it not 30? Why was it not 20? Why is it 50?
because I'm trying to give myself as much room to be correct as possible.
Okay.
That's why I'm plus or mining it by 50. But you're right. I mean, sometimes I plus or minus it by 30 if I'm
Is it
a
like
little
a
bit more
percentage or like
confident.
a general guide that you apply depending on that? Because let's say, for example, if it's a 600K property, like in this case, your estimated price was around 1.4. So 50K kind of makes sense. But if it's a 600K property, if you're doing
Yeah,
50
yeah, yeah, that's right.
plus minus,
Yep,
that's quite a lot of
correct.
variations, right?
Yeah,
So
that's a very good point. So in this instance, 50,000 is what, 3.5%,
yeah,
maybe a bit less. So, giving it
you're
a
about a
plus or minus
3.5% plus
3%
minus.
range, yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
is quite reasonable. But I don't consciously think what's 3%. Um,
Mm,
yeah.
mm. It's called experience, but yeah, I'm just trying to basically extrapolate that and say, well, what's the logic behind how you arrive at that magical figure?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But I want to say I'm asking and trying to deduce what's a reasonable,
Yep.
like if I'm trying to get ahead of this concept that the market's crazy and the prices are ridiculous. I'm trying to get ahead of that because it's almost never true. There are some properties that go over expectations, but they rarely go to a level that you can't justify using one of the methods,
Mm,
which is quite interesting because I've seen people come say, oh, it was a crazy price. But the yield capitalization method would have predicted that price.
mm.
Um, or maybe there was a recent comparable. So, um, so I always give myself a range, and I always say that actually, when we're buying properties, there is no the price. There's only a range until the hammer goes down. Until the property gets sold, there's only a
Yeah.
range,
Yeah.
a reasonable range, and that's why you try to keep it as open as possible.
Have you ever had the price finder report result or the estimated comparables result actually higher than the yield capitalization method?
Yes, yeah, that happens sometimes.
And in that instance, what figure do you actually take and how do you derive? Like what's your thinking there?
Yeah, well, I mean, the comparables are generally speaking for residential real estate a better guide.
Mm,
Um, but what yield capitalization does is gives the comparables, which is the primary way you value real estate,
yes.
it gives it reinforcement.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
if I'm given a guide of 1.2 and I come up with comparables of like 1.35, I'm thinking, oh crap, is this right or have I made a mistake?
Mm,
Then you run the other method. It's like, no, it's actually reinforcing that
okay.
it's around that 135. But what we're not doing is like comparables are the primary method.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
the primary method. And you find all real estate agents will say the one upstairs went for this, and the one downstairs, the one across the road, because comparables are how we do residential real estate. But
Yeah.
we're actually trying to build up a case, as a lawyer might do, trying to come up
Mm,
with different methodologies to fortify an argument, which is sort of what this is saying.
mm,
Um, and that's what yield capitalization does.
yeah. Okay.
When they do the challenge is in instances where there aren't many comparables. So that sometimes it comes back and says computer says no, like there aren't enough comparables for this type of property. So quirky properties are difficult to value. There were times I'm trying to think 2022, a lot of the price finder reports came back without being able to, there just weren't enough sales
Mm,
that were recent enough and relevant enough to generate a comparable. But that was a couple of years ago now. So that was quite interesting. So the challenge is only in like very low volume markets
yeah.
when you can't even do it.
Yeah. Very low number of actual comparables
Yep.
in that
Yep.
especially in the time range as well. Because what generally within the comparables, do you want to keep it within like last 6 months? Or, if you look at comparables that's over a year to 2 years, can you still use those as comparables?
Yeah, well, that's right. So if you get a really old comparable, you have to dial it up and say, even though it's identical, because it was so long ago and the market's moved 5%, you
Mm,
have to say, well, that comparable is inferior. You have to treat it like it's got
like an inferior. Yeah.
one bathroom less than the subject property. So
Okay.
you have to dial it down. But generally speaking, it won't give you anything too old.
Yeah. Okay.
It's a very good tool. It is a subscription tool too.
It is, and that actually leads to my next question as well, because not everyone has a price finder subscription, and we know it's if you're not working in the real estate industry, generally it probably doesn't make sense to actually have one. So if people want to try to follow the logic here in terms of trying to work it out without the price finder tool, do you have any suggestions in terms of how they can do that? Maybe through a manual type of process of
Yeah.
digging up the similar type of properties that it can do, and then, do a manual filter to say, like, yep, this property is superior, so therefore I should plus minus. This property is inferior,
No.
maybe I should plus minus. What
So
would you use?
the first thing is like use a buyer's agent. They've got tools that they pay for, and like that's
Sure.
one way to have quite a sophisticated way to do this sort of stuff.
Yep.
Um, the other way is like almost every property real estate website has some sort of equivalent of the desktop valuations. The thing is, it's not so easy to trust it if it hasn't been adjusted for
Mm,
the superior or the inferiority of the comparable. I mean, you listener would have looked up your own house, let's say, and you would have gone onto the domain website or the real estate website or property value or on the house, and they're all great. They're all great, but you would have seen it throw back a valuation that you say my house is worth a lot more than that, like materially more or less potentially.
yep.
And you'd be right, and you would be right. And the reason for that is that desktop valuations aren't very good at determining the condition of a property, and sometimes it's not very good at adjusting for land size. It's just looking at medians.
Mm,
And
mm.
so, and so what would I suggest to someone who's trying to do this at home? Try to use as many of them as you can. I mentioned a couple, but property value I think is the same as domain. Um, Domain has one itself. You can add a property, realestate.com. They're all great. And on the house is great as well. And on the house will give you a range as well. Uh, so that's
So yeah,
useful.
so what you're saying is basically pull source, so put in the address and then try to look up as many separate data sources as you possibly
Yeah.
can from those websites you have, and
Yeah.
then try to derive at potentially maybe a median value of some sort
Yeah,
across all of
exactly.
them.
Exactly. And you can look, I would also suggest asking ChatGPT what the last property that sold in the block was.
That's okay. That's a very good
Yeah.
one.
Yeah.
Can you get ChatGPT to do that comparable for you?
ChatGPT is pretty good. It's just not that current. Like but it will get better. And could you get it to the comparable? Probably. I haven't asked.
Yeah.
I do ask it certain things, like I'll ask it how many units in the block, because you want to know that sort of stuff. And so I'll ask
Mm,
ChatGPT that. It's
mm.
very clever. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, putting AI
But it
into it.
doesn't. It shies away from doing valuation. So I doubt it. I doubt it would do that.
Oh, have you tried? Ask it like,
I have tried. I've tried everything. So yeah. So that's yeah. So my conclusion from this is it's worth 1.4 million plus or minus 50 grand, and I
mm,
think that is reinforced by the different methods, and I think that would is what would prevail on auction day if it goes to auction in this sort of hypothetical-ish
yep.
property example. But yes, I would like if there is a property that you like and that you're planning to go to auction, I would run a couple of different models. I would also run different comparables from different websites and write them all down and say, okay, where's and it's not the midpoint. You're probably looking for the highest value rather than
Highest
the
value.
midpoint.
Okay. Okay.
Because if you go to an auction, you don't win by being the guy who estimated the average of all the opinions.
Of
You have
course.
to have the highest, you have to be the highest estimate plus $5,000, right?
Yep. Yep.
So no one's successful at auction by thinking it's worth the median price. So it always has to be the highest plus a bid.
Mm, mm. Yeah.
So
Interesting. Okay.
line up all the valuations, take the highest, and then add $10,000, and then that's
Yeah.
probably the where it will land at an auction.
And you mentioned the fourth one, which is basically market sentiments. So how do you determine what, how do you factor that in terms of your range?
Well, that is where my experience comes into it. So if it's a very, so I will have been to an open for inspection. I will have seen if it's busy. I'll know how many people have done asked for a contract, although that's not particularly relevant. But I would have seen, I would have asked how many people have downloaded a strata report. That's relevant.
Okay. Yep. That's a good one.
So that's really important. So you know that if there's a general macro sentiment that's positive right now, properties are, clearance rates are relatively high. So right now, there's no feeding frenzy, but prices are rising and there's fairly strong sentiment in the market. It's
Mm,
not a feeding frenzy, it's not crazy, and each market, each suburb is different. But right now, it's positive positive. So right now you're saying, okay, we've got a range. It's probably at the higher end of the range,
mm.
just because sentiments. And we both watched the news and we both expect there probably be two more rate cuts this year after a rate cut that's already happened. So generally speaking, we're in a asset price inflationary period, but it's relatively gentle. So yeah, so I'm looking just from that. I'm going to be looking at the upper end of the range, unless I know that it's a property that's stale or they've struggled to sell it and so on. So
Yeah.
yeah, you just use your judgment.
Fair enough. Okay, good. All right. Well, thanks, John. Thanks for sharing this. I think this is basically an approach that can help, hopefully help our listeners in terms of arriving and deriving at what sort of offer prices
Yeah,
they can go for, so they can arm themselves with that. Um, in our next episode, we will then basically uncover the next part, which is basically talking about how you can go about negotiating with the sales agent and try to maximize your chance of securing the property as well. So it goes through the offer process, goes through how you can actually, negotiate to your advantage as much as you can. This is obviously John's years of experience coming into play. So he will be
yeah,
able to share a lot of value there. Yeah, because I think, in a market like this now, you know there's a lot of potential buyers that you're going against. So how do you make yourself stand out, and how do you optimize your chance of winning in securing that property
Yep.
is going to be key. Okay, so
Yep.
awesome. All
We'll,
right,
we'll do
thanks,
the
John.
dance next time.
I don't mind, John, if you like to. Happy to provide some sort of props if you also like to. But
You can, yeah, you can lead. No, but the dance with the real estate agent.
the dance of real station, that's the one,
Yeah,
mate. Tango,
that's
or
right. That's
waltz,
right.
whichever one you like. All right. Well, any questions today for John, you can always just basically leave a comment below or let us know. Otherwise, have a great week, and we'll see you guys again in another episode of Spark Your Fire. Cheers, John and David.